Dead America, 23 Miles, Part 4, by Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. Riley kept her foot on the brake and stared through the windshield at the parking lot ahead of her. The SUV sat idling at the top of the entry drive, the heater humming on low, the wipers flicking aside the light snow that had started falling a few minutes back. Beyond the hood, the asphalt spread out between the three buildings in a wide U-shape, and every inch of it was crawling. The dead moved in slow, overlapping patterns across the pavement, drifting between the abandoned cars and the planter islands, their arms swaying, their heads tilted at that familiar forward angle. A few of the closest ones had already turned at the sound of the engine, their faces swiveling up the drive toward her, pale and slack in the gray light, their mouths working open and shut. She tried to count them and gave up. 30 was a conservative guess, and it could have been closer to 50. How in the hell do I do this? Her hands stayed on the wheel. She let the SUV sit where it was for another few seconds, the engine ticking, the heater pushing warm air across her knees. The three buildings in front of her were identical. 3 stories each, brick on the bottom floor, tan siding above it, with the same pitched roofs and the same rows of windows spaced at the same intervals. One on the left, one on the right. One at the back of the lot between them. Whoever had designed the complex had built the 3 buildings to match, and from where she sat, there was no way to tell which one held apartment 315. Riley reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and pulled out Pam's wallet. She flipped it open in her lap, keeping one hand on the wheel, and tilted the driver's license toward the light from the windshield. The address was printed in small type beneath the photograph. She read it through once, then again, her eyes settling on the street number at the start of the line. 1437. That has to be the building number. She closed the wallet and slid it back into her jacket, her eyes going to the buildings again. She leaned forward across the steering wheel, squinting through the glass. The faces of the buildings were too far out for her to read anything on them. She could see dark rectangles mounted above the entryways where the address plates had to be, but the numerals themselves were lost in the distance and the gray of the falling snow. She would have to get closer. Okay, one at a time. She took her foot off the brake, and the SUV rolled forward down the short entry drive, the tires crunching across the packed snow with a sound that felt obscenely loud in the closed cab. The pavement flattened out at the bottom, and the lot opened up around her. She swung the wheel to the left, aiming for the perimeter, the edge that ran along the west side of the property where the asphalt met a low strip of planters and the wooden privacy fence beyond them. If she was going to do this, she was going to do it from the outside in, working the edge of the lot and keeping the cars between her and the open ground where the dead were thickest. The moment she committed to the turn, the lot responded. Every head in the parking area came up, and every body pivoted in place and started shuffling forward. The zombies that had been drifting between the cars broke their patterns and started converging, the closer ones already closing the distance, the farther ones turning and starting the long walk across the pavement toward the sound of the engine. The ones at the back of the lot were slower to react. They didn't have to be fast. They only had to be coming, and they were coming from every direction at once. Riley felt her pulse climb in her throat. She kept her foot light on the pedal and her grip loose on the wheel, forcing her breathing to stay slow and steady. Just drive, get the number, make the turn, get the number. The first building rolled past on her left as she cleared the end of the entry drive and came alongside the west face of the structure. She looked up and out her side window, her eyes searching the front of the building for the address plate. There, mounted above the glass double doors of the main entrance, a dark rectangle with the numbers picked out in what looked like brass. She caught the 4 and the 1, kept rolling, and caught the next 2. Another 4, another 1. 1441. It's either the middle or right building. She kept the SUV moving. The first zombies had reached her by then, the closest ones slapping their palms against the driver's side window as she rolled past, their faces pressed flat against the glass, their mouths working. One of them slid along the side of the vehicle for a full car length before its feet tangled and it went down, bouncing off the rear quarter panel as she pulled ahead. Another one stumbled out from between 2 parked cars and met the front bumper head-on. The impact was slow, almost gentle, but the body still folded under the grill and went down, and she felt the front wheel roll up and over, something she didn't want to think about. The SUV bucked once and settled. Riley's hands tightened on the wheel, and her eyes stayed forward. She drew in a long breath through her nose and let it out slowly through her mouth, counting the seconds on the exhale the way her father had taught her to count before a difficult shot. 4 in, 4 out. The tightness in her chest didn't go away, but it stopped building, and that was enough. She kept going. The back of the lot came up, and she swung the wheel to the right, following the perimeter along the rear of the property. The middle building sat directly across from her now, its back face visible through the blowing snow. The dumpster enclosures set along the base of the wall between the service doors. The rear of the building had a small address plate of its own, mounted beside one of the service doors, smaller than the front plate but readable if she got the angle right. She slowed the SUV to a crawl and leaned across the passenger seat, her eyes working the wall until she found what she was looking for. 1439. Right one it is. She pulled her eyes off the plate and looked ahead. The back corner of the lot was coming up, and the third building was starting to come into view, the rear wall visible now through the steady curtain of snow. The zombies that had been spread across the middle of the lot were pushing toward her in a loose, staggered line, a slow tide of them working their way across the pavement with their arms out and their heads tilted, the sound of their combined moaning audible now, even through the closed windows. Behind her, the ones she had already passed were falling in at the tail of the group, grinding along in her wake. She made the turn around the back corner and brought the SUV up the east side of the property, getting closer to the building with every passing second. Her eyes moved across the front of it as it came into view, searching for the entrance. A wide sidewalk ran the length of the building from the parking lot to the front doors, and in the middle of that sidewalk, set into the ground floor, at the central axis of the building, was a covered stairwell entrance. The kind of interior stairwell that served all 3 floors of the complex, with a glass door at the base and the stairs visible behind it, rising up into the dark of the upper landings. There you are. She turned the wheel hard and cut straight into the middle of the lot. The SUV bumped up over the curb of a planter island, its tires crunching through a frozen hedge, and dropped down onto the main body of the parking lot. Zombies were everywhere. They filled the open pavement on every side, shambling toward her from all 4 points of the compass, and the front bumper started pushing through them like a plow through snow. Bodies thumped against the grill, shoulders bounced off the fenders. One of them hit the hood at an angle and tumbled sideways, its weight sliding across the sheet metal before it rolled off into the path of the next wave. Riley kept her speed steady, fast enough to move them out of her way, slow enough to keep the tires in contact with the asphalt. The sidewalk was 20 yards out. 15. 10. She pulled up short of the curb and stopped. All right, 3-point turn. You got this. She cranked the wheel to the right and pulled forward into an open patch of pavement, then turned the wheel back hard to the left and threw the SUV into reverse. The transmission dropped with a clunk and the backup lights cut on, washing the pavement behind her in a pale red glow. She craned her head over the seat, lined up her angle through the rear glass, and eased onto the pedal. The rear tires bit, then caught a patch of slush, then caught solid ground, and the SUV started rolling backward toward the sidewalk. She held the wheel steady and watched through the back glass as the curb came up. The rear wheels hit the edge of the sidewalk and bounced, the suspension compressing and rebounding, and the SUV rolled up onto the concrete with a hard jolt that rattled the whole cab. The back bumper caught a zombie that had been standing right at the edge and threw it forward off its feet, the body disappearing under the rear axle for a second before the tires rolled past it. Another one went down against the passenger side, its arm bending in a direction it wasn't built for, the face sliding along the quarter panel as the SUV pushed through. The rear tires held on the packed snow covering the sidewalk. She kept backing up, steering by the line of the stairwell in the rearview mirror, inching closer with each slow foot of travel. 10 yards out, the tires started to lose their grip. The wheels spun for a second, caught again, spun a second time. The sidewalk under the snow had a slick patch somewhere back there, and she could feel the rear end starting to want to slide. She brought the SUV to a stop, and her eyes went to the rearview mirror, her stomach dropping at what she saw. 3 zombies stood between the back of the SUV and the stairwell. They had pushed up through the crowd before she finished her turn, and now they were planted on the sidewalk, blocking the last 10 yards between her and the entrance. Behind them, the main body of the horde was still slipping and shambling across the parking lot. the closest edge of it maybe 30 yards out. She had a window. Not a big one, but a window. She reached up and hit the button for the sunroof. The panels slid back with a soft whir, and a blast of cold air rushed into the cab, carrying the sound of the moaning in the lot with it. Riley unclipped her seatbelt, pulled the bow up from the passenger footwell, and stood up through the opening. The quiver strap caught on the edge of the sunroof frame for a second before she worked it free. She settled her boots on the driver's seat, braced her hips against the front edge of the opening, and rose into the cold. The three zombies on the sidewalk had turned toward the sound of the engine. Their mouths were open, their arms coming up. The closest was maybe 15 feet off the rear bumper. Riley pulled an arrow from the quiver, fitted it against the string, and drew. The first shot took the closest one clean through the forehead, and it dropped straight down onto the concrete, its legs folding under it. She set the next arrow against the string before the body had finished landing, drew on the second zombie, and released. The arrow buried itself in the side of its head above the ear, and the creature pitched sideways against a planter and slid down into the snow. The third had turned fully around by then and was shambling toward the SUV with its arms out. Riley put an arrow through its eye socket, and it went down backward, the shaft still protruding from the ruin of its face as its shoulders hit the concrete. 10 arrows down to 7, every one of them in a body she didn't have time to recover. She dropped back into the cab. The horde in the lot was closer now, the nearest edge maybe 20 yards out and closing. She threw the driver's door open, grabbed the bow, and swung her legs out onto the running board. The engine kept running behind her, the heater still ticking, the headlights still pushing their pale light across the pavement. Letting the engine die out here and praying it would turn over again was a gamble she wasn't willing to take. She hit the ground running, her boots pounding the concrete, the quiver bouncing against her back, the bow held low in her left hand. 10 yards to the stairwell. The closest zombies in the lot turned at the sound of her boots and started shambling in her direction, but they were too far out and too slow to close the distance. She reached the glass door of the stairwell, grabbed the handle, and yanked it open. The door swung outward with a clean metallic click, and she pushed through into the cold, concrete-walled interior, letting the door swing shut behind her. The sound of the moaning in the lot dropped to a muffled hum. She took the first flight of stairs 2 steps at a time and stopped on the first landing, her hand on the railing, her chest heaving. Above her, the stairwell climbed up into the shadows of the second floor and beyond. The light coming in through the narrow window at the top of each landing cut the dark into slices of gray. "All right, Pam, let's hope you're the medication hoarder. I think you are." Chapter 2. Riley gave herself one more breath on the first landing, then started up. The stairwell climbed in tight switchbacks between the floors, each flight running a short span before doubling back against the wall. She kept the bow in her left hand and fitted an arrow against the string before she took the second flight, drawing to half tension as she moved. The concrete steps were clean and dry, swept free of snow, the way only an interior stairwell could be, and her boots made soft scuffing sounds against the painted surface that carried further up the shaft than she wanted. She worked her footfalls into the quieter rhythm she had learned over the last 2.5 months. Heel first, rolling forward, keeping her weight balanced so nothing thumped. The sounds still carried, but they softened. The second floor landing opened onto a carpeted hallway that ran off in both directions from the stairwell door. The door itself was propped open with a small rubber wedge someone had kicked under the bottom edge, holding it ajar, maybe 6 inches. Riley stopped at the top of the flight and held her position. She listened. The moaning from the parking lot was gone now, cut off by 2 sets of doors and 3 floors of concrete and steel. The silence that replaced it was almost complete, broken only by the soft hum of her own breathing and the faint tick of some heating system that had given up weeks ago but still made small noises as the air moved through it. She eased forward and glanced through the gap in the door, first one way down the carpeted hall, then the other. Both directions ran straight and empty, the apartment doors closed along both walls, the light coming through a single frosted window at the far end of each run. Nothing moved, nothing made a sound. She pulled back from the gap and kept climbing. The third flight was steeper in her legs than the first 2 had been, the cold and the adrenaline of the parking lot finally catching up with her. Her thighs burned by the time she hit the halfway landing and turned for the last half flight up to 3. She slowed her pace on the final steps and brought the bow up to full draw, sighting across the top of the arrow as her head cleared the level of the floor. That was when she heard it, a soft shuffle of feet against carpet, somewhere off to the right of the stairwell door. Then a dragging sound, the toe of a shoe catching on the edge of something and pulling free. Then the low, thin moan that she had heard 1,000 times by now, rising up slow and building out of a throat that hadn't drawn a real breath in weeks. Riley eased up the last 2 steps without letting the draw off, her eyes over the arrow, her breathing slow. The 3rd floor landing opened onto a hallway laid out the same as the one below, the stairwell door propped in the same way with a rubber wedge. Through the gap, she could see the end of the hall that ran off to the right, and the zombie drifting along the carpet maybe 30 feet from the door. A man in what had been a dress shirt and slacks, the shirt dark at the collar and down one sleeve, his feet turned slightly inward as he shuffled, his head tilted forward at that familiar angle. He hadn't heard her yet. He was working his way along the hall with no particular direction, his arms hanging at his sides, his face toward the far wall. She nudged the stairwell door open another few inches with her shoulder and stepped through into the hallway. The zombie caught the movement at the edge of his vision and started turning. His head came around slowly, his mouth opening, and the moan in his throat rose half a note. Riley released before it could build into something that carried. The arrow crossed the distance in a blink and punched through the side of his head above the temple, and he went down sideways against the wall, his shoulder hitting first, the rest of him folding to the carpet after it. The body slid a few inches along the baseboard before coming to rest with one arm thrown out across the floor and the other pinned beneath him. Riley held her position and listened. Nothing came. No answering moans, no sounds from the apartments along the hall, no footfalls from any direction. "How did you get up here?" She said it quietly, more to herself than to the corpse, but she meant the question. The rules had held for 2.5 months now. The dead couldn't manage stairs with any kind of purpose. They might stumble onto a step if they were following a noise and one happened to be in front of them, but they couldn't climb 3 flights with intention. Whoever this man had been, he hadn't walked up here on his own 2 feet. Someone had led him up, or he had died up here already and turned in place. She moved down the hall toward the body, keeping the bow ready, her eyes tracking along the closed apartment doors on both sides. When she reached him, she put her boot against his shoulder, worked the arrow free with a slow pull, and wiped the broadhead on the fabric of his shirt, before sliding the shaft back into the quiver. The head came out clean, the shaft straight. Still 7. She stepped past the body and kept going. She got her bearings as she walked. The apartments along the right-hand side of the hall ran in a descending line of door numbers, the plates mounted at eye height beside each frame. 321, 320, 319. She was moving in the right direction. 315 would be 6 doors further along. She made it 4 before she stopped. The door at 317 stood open, not ajar. Wide open, the door pulled back flat against the inside wall of the apartment. The frame empty from the hall. Dark streaks ran across the face of the door at waist height, and continued down onto the carpet in front of it, smears of something that had dried to a dark brown, but still held the shape of a handprint where someone had pressed against it on the way out. A patch of carpet just inside the threshold was stained through to the pad beneath, the stain spreading in a rough oval that reached halfway across the entryway. She could see into the front room of the apartment from where she stood, the edge of a couch visible against the far wall, a coffee table knocked sideways, the darker suggestion of something on the floor beyond it that she didn't let her eyes linger on. A soft sound came from deeper inside, the shuffle of something pushing against furniture, maybe, or a body working its way slowly across a cluttered floor. Then the start of a moan, quiet and low, cutting off almost as soon as it began. Riley's hand tightened on the bow. She stood still for a 3 count and let her eyes work the room beyond the doorway, without moving her head, scanning for shape or motion. She caught nothing that would tell her how many. 1, probably, maybe more. She wasn't going to find out. She slid sideways along the hallway wall, keeping out of the sight line of the open door, until her shoulder was pressed against the frame itself. Then she reached across the opening with her free hand, caught the inside edge of the door with her fingers, and pulled it toward her in one slow, steady motion. The door swung on its hinges with a soft creak and came around against the frame with a muted click as the latch caught. She paused, waiting to see if the sound would draw anything forward, but nothing came. The hallway stayed quiet. She kept moving. 316, 315. The door was closed. She stopped in front of it and let her hand rest against the surface for a moment, without trying the handle, her forehead almost touching the wood. She closed her eyes. She wasn't a praying person, had never been one in any kind of formal way, but she let something that might have been a prayer pass through her head anyway. A few words aimed at no particular listener, asking for this one thing to go the way she needed it to go. Then she opened her eyes, dropped her hand to the knob, and turned it. The knob turned an inch and stopped, locked. That's a good sign. She fished Pam's keys out of her jacket pocket, found the one that looked like it matched a deadbolt, and slid it into the upper lock. It turned on the first try, the bolt retracting with a clean metallic sound. She tried the knob again and felt it give all the way this time. She eased the door open a few inches and stopped, listening through the gap. Nothing, no sound from the apartment beyond, no movement, no moans. She pushed the door all the way open and stepped inside, sliding the knife from her hip as she crossed the threshold. The bow she kept in her left hand, the arrow still on the string at half draw. She pulled the door shut behind her with her heel and heard the latch catch, and then she stood in the entry for a long second and just breathed. The apartment was still. The air inside felt undisturbed, colder than the hallway, but not by much, carrying the faint mixed smell of old coffee grounds and dish soap, and the kind of laundry detergent somebody liked enough to use exclusively. Dust sat in a thin layer across the small entry table, but the layer was even and unbroken, nothing smeared or disturbed. A row of hooks by the door held a fleece jacket, a canvas tote bag, and a scarf wrapped twice around one of the hooks. Beyond the entry, the front room opened up into a small living space with a couch, a low bookshelf, and a kitchen visible through a pass-through on the far wall. Everything was in its place. Nothing had been knocked over, nothing had been pulled out, nothing had been touched. That's an even better sign. She moved through the apartment with the knife low and the bow ready, sweeping each room in turn. The front room and kitchen took maybe 30 seconds. She cleared the small dining nook, the hall closet, the bedroom at the end of the short hallway with its bed still made and its curtains still drawn, the second bedroom set up as a home office, the hall bath. Nothing moved. No one had been here since Pam had walked out the door on the morning she had gone into work and never come home. She came back out into the hall, slid the knife into its sheath, and let the bow drop to a loose hold at her side. The bathroom off the main hall was the one she wanted. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, and her eyes went straight to the mirrored cabinet above the sink. She set the bow across the edge of the counter and opened the cabinet with both hands. The shelves were stocked. Toothpaste, mouthwash, a row of small brown bottles, a box of cotton swabs, a prescription tube of something for skin, a tin of lip balm, vitamins in 3 different sizes. Her eyes jumped across the labels, scanning for what she needed, her fingers already moving the bottles aside to get at the ones in the back. Come on, where are you?" She worked through the cabinet one shelf at a time. Allergy tablets, ibuprofen, aspirin, a bottle of sleep aids, a small round container of some kind of herbal supplement. Nothing that would bring down a fever driven by infection. Nothing labeled as cold or flu medicine. Nothing with a brand she recognized. She pulled the last bottle on the bottom shelf forward, read the label, and dropped it back into place. Damn it! She stood with her hands braced against the edge of the sink and stared at her reflection in the half of the mirror that wasn't still hanging open. Her face looked back at her, pale beneath the grime and the windburn, a dark bruise coming up along her jaw that she hadn't even registered she had. She held the look for a beat before her eyes slid sideways in the glass to the door of the towel closet behind her. She turned and opened it. The closet was narrow and deep, a stack of folded towels filling the bottom shelf, a pile of washcloths on the second. Above them, on the middle shelf at eye height, someone had lined up bottles, boxes, and blister packs in neat rows, the brand names she had grown up with printed across a dozen different labels. Cold medicine, flu medicine, allergy medication. A row of small white bottles with prescription labels she recognized from the pharmacy counter in Chaffee, the long clinical names printed in the same style as the labels on the floor of the pharmacy back in town. But these ones she knew. Amoxicillin, azithromycin. Her mother had been on amoxicillin twice in the last 4 years for the kind of infections that kept coming back. Riley reached out and picked up a bottle of extra-strength flu medication from the middle of the row. She turned it over in her hand, read the label, read it again. The plastic was cool against her fingers. The cap was sealed. The expiration date was still a year out. She started crying before she knew she was going to. It came up out of her chest in a single hard sob that bent her forward at the waist, her free hand going out to brace against the doorframe of the closet, the bottle still clutched against her chest in the other. The tears came fast, and she didn't fight them. She let them come, her shoulders shaking, her forehead dropping to rest against the edge of the door. The small plastic bottle pressed against her sternum, like she was afraid it would evaporate if she set it down. 23 miles, 2.5 months. Her mother burning up under wet rags with Harper sitting at the edge of the bed, waiting. Every step of the walk, every zombie she had put down, every arrow she had loosed, every mile through the snow and the woods and the looted streets of Superior, and it came down to this. A bottle in her hand, in a towel closet in an apartment 3 floors above the dead. She let herself cry for a full minute before she made herself straighten up. She wiped her face with the back of her sleeve and looked at the shelf again. 3 more packages of the same medication sat further along the row, lined up behind a box of tissues. Beside them, 2 more bottles of the amoxicillin, a second of the azithromycin, and a handful of smaller bottles she would sort through before she packed anything, enough to treat her mother through whatever this infection was, and enough to keep a reserve for whatever came next. "All right, Mom, I'm going to get you better." Chapter 3. Riley cleared the shelf in minutes. She went through the bottles one at a time, reading labels and setting them into a canvas tote bag she had pulled off the hook by the front door. The flu medication first. All 4 packages stacked flat across the bottom of the bag. Then the amoxicillin and the azithromycin, wrapped in a folded washcloth to keep the bottles from clattering against each other. The allergy medication, the cold tablets, the small bottles of cough suppressant, the blister packs of fever reducer that weren't the same as what she had already carried out of the pharmacy, but would stretch the supply further. She left the vitamins and the herbal supplements where they sat. Whatever she couldn't identify or trust, she left alone. Her mother didn't need a guessing game. Her mother needed the bottles with names Riley could read and spell. When the shelf was empty of everything she wanted, she slung the tote over her shoulder and walked into the kitchen. The refrigerator was the first thing she tried and the first thing she closed. The smell that rolled out when she cracked the door was thick, sweet, and wrong, the kind of smell that told her everything she needed to know about what had happened inside over the last 2.5 months. She pushed the door shut without looking at what was on the shelves, breathed through her mouth until the smell cleared, and moved to the pantry. That went faster. Crackers gone soft in their boxes. A jar of peanut butter she took and wedged into the bag. A bag of trail mix she took without opening. A stack of snack bars and a small cardboard display, the kind that came in 12 packs from a warehouse store. And she took those too, pulling the individual bars out and stuffing them into the side pockets of her backpack, where they would fit without crowding anything else. The cans on the bottom shelf she passed on. Too heavy, too slow to open without tools, not worth the wait for the walk back. She closed the pantry door and turned to the sink. Her hand went to the faucet more out of habit than expectation, and she gave the handle a quarter turn without really thinking about it. Water came out. Water's still working. She stared at the small silver stream for a second, watching it swirl down the drain. The city must have had a gravity-fed reservoir somewhere above the town, or a pressurized system that hadn't lost enough to drop below the 3rd floor yet. She didn't know the specifics, and she didn't have time to work them out. What she did know was that she was thirsty in a way she had stopped registering, her mouth dry from the cold and the driving and the long morning of climbing, and there was a full glass waiting for her if she wanted it. She pulled a glass from the cabinet above the sink, filled it to the top, and drank it down without stopping. The water was clear and cold and tasted faintly of the pipes it had come through, metallic at the back of the throat, but she didn't care. She filled the glass a second time and drank half of it before she made herself stop. Then she unclipped the water bottle from the side of her backpack, emptied what was left of the stale contents into the sink, and filled the bottle to the brim before sealing it again. 2 liters of fresh water she hadn't had 10 minutes ago. That was going to matter on the trip back. She slung the bag across her body and walked to the front window. The living room window looked out over the parking lot. She pulled the curtain aside with 2 fingers and leaned in to see what was waiting for her below. The SUV sat right where she had left it, up on the sidewalk 10 yards from the stairwell entrance, the backup lights still glowing a pale red against the snow, the exhaust rising in a thin plume from the tailpipe into the gray morning. The engine was still running. The driver's side door hung open the way she had left it when she bailed out. And around the vehicle, pressing in from every angle, was a crowd. She tried to count and gave up somewhere past 20. They ringed the SUV on all sides, some of them with their hands pressed against the windows, some of them bumping against the open driver's door, some of them leaning against the rear quarter panels. The noise of the engine had pulled every zombie in the parking lot straight to the vehicle, and they had settled in around it like it was going to start feeding them if they waited long enough. "I'm not sure my legs are going to let me walk 23 miles back." The words came out flat, and she meant them. The last 2 days had used up something inside her she couldn't easily replace. Her legs had been tired when she came up the stairs. They were worse now that she had stopped moving. The idea of pushing back out into the parking lot on foot, of fighting her way clear of that crowd and then walking every mile of the route she had traveled to get here, of doing it through the snow and the dead with a bag full of medicine banging against her hip, was not an idea she wanted to think about. The SUV was 20 feet away, through a pane of glass and a wall. The SUV could carry her home in a few hours instead of days. The SUV was the difference between her mother getting the medicine in time and her mother not getting the medicine in time. She pulled the curtain open a few more inches and looked past the vehicle to the rest of the lot. The cars she had driven past on her way in were still there, scattered across the pavement in a loose pattern, windows broken out of most of them from earlier looting. The nearest one sat roughly 70 yards from the building, an older sedan parked at an angle with its hood pointed away from her. A shot from the 3rd floor at that distance would be a long shot, but it wouldn't be impossible. She had put broadheads into deer at further ranges with her father, and a car was a target that wasn't going to move. The arrow hitting the car diversion worked at the pharmacy. It might work again. She set the tote bag on the floor and looked at the window. It was a standard double-hung, a bottom sash she could push up to open the lower half. She flipped the lock at the top of the lower sash, got her fingers under the lip, and pushed. The window stuck for a second against the cold, then gave and slid up, the sash rising smoothly into the upper half, until she had the bottom half of the opening clear. Cold air came in, and she leaned forward and looked down. The angle gave her a clean line from the sill out across the parking lot. No awnings or balcony rails in the way, no trees blocking the flight path to the distant car. Okay, this could work. She carried the tote bag and the backpack to the front door and set them down together on the entry mat, where she could grab both in one motion on the way out. Then she came back to the window, pulled an arrow from the quiver, and took her position at the sill. She checked the count before she drew. 7, lower than I would like. You gotta make them count. She set the arrow on the string, raised the bow, and drew. The angle was steep. She had to aim out and down at the same time, and the pin on her sight was set for level shots at closer distances. She held her breath, adjusted her aim high to compensate for the drop across 70 yards, and released. The arrow sailed. She followed the flight with her eyes, watching the shaft arc across the open pavement toward the hood of the distant sedan. It came in short. The arrow clattered down onto the snow a few yards before the front bumper of the car, skipped once against the frozen crust, and slid to a stop against a wheel. The sound of the impact was too faint to travel up to her at the window, and none of the zombies around the SUV so much as turned. She let out a slow breath through her nose before pulling another arrow from the quiver and setting it against the string. Her fingers worked through the draw by muscle memory, while her eyes stayed on the car. She adjusted her aim another 2 inches higher, accounted for the short fall of the first shot, and loosed. The second arrow hit the front panel of the sedan with a high metallic ping that carried clean across the parking lot and up to the 3rd floor window. The shaft stuck for a half second before it fell away and clattered down onto the pavement beside the tire. "Come on, take the bait. Take the bait." She leaned into the window and watched. For a long second, nothing happened. The crowd around the SUV still pressed in against the vehicle. No heads turning, no feet moving. Then the closer ones at the outer edge of the crowd started to shift. A few heads came up. A few bodies pivoted. The zombies nearest the source of the sound began to peel off from the crowd and shamble in the direction of the car, one after another, their patterns breaking apart as they started the slow walk across the lot. Half the crowd moved, maybe a little more than half. The other half, the ones pressed tightest against the rear of the SUV near the driver's door, didn't react at all. 15 or so zombies, still packed in at the back of the vehicle, right in the path she needed to take. Damn it! She knocked a third arrow and loosed it at the car with her aim already dialed in. The shaft hit the front panel in almost the same spot. The metallic ping just as loud. The sound carrying just as clean across the lot. She watched the crowd at the SUV. 5 more zombies broke off and started the walk. The rest held their position. That's going to have to do. She pulled back from the window. The ones she had peeled away were committed now, their backs to the SUV, their slow shuffle carrying them toward the sedan at the pace the dead always moved. 10 or so still lingered around the vehicle, more than she wanted, but fewer than there had been. She picked up the tote bag and the backpack from the entry, opened the apartment door, and let herself out into the hall. She pulled the door shut behind her, heard the latch catch, and headed for the stairwell. The climb down went faster than the climb up. She came out on the first floor, landing a minute later, pushed through the stairwell door into the ground floor hallway, and stopped at the glass door that led back out to the sidewalk. She put her hand on the push bar and looked out. The SUV sat where she had left it, the backup lights still glowing, and the crowd at its back end was smaller than it had been, but still too big. She counted 10 and a handful more. A sprint from this door to the driver's side of the vehicle would put her in the middle of them before she was halfway there. She pulled her hand off the bar. Her eyes went back down the ground floor hallway the way she had come. The carpeted corridor ran off into the distance, doors lining both walls, the light at the far end of it coming through a second exit that stood maybe 100 yards away at the opposite side of the building. She stared at it. A side exit. Same building, different corner. If she could pull the zombies at the SUV to the front door here and leave them chewing on the glass, the side exit at the far end of the hall would put her out on a part of the property with no dead between her and the vehicle. She ran the plan through in her head once. You're going to have to haul ass if you do this. She ran it through a second time, looking for the hole in it, and didn't find one she couldn't live with. Then she put her hand back on the push bar of the stairwell door, pulled it open a foot, and rapped her knuckles against the inside of the glass 3 times, hard. I'm over here. Her voice carried out onto the sidewalk, and the crowd at the SUV heard it. Heads came up, bodies pivoted. The ones closest to her broke away from the vehicle and started the slow walk in her direction. The rest following a beat later as the sound registered across the wider group. She let the door ease shut against the frame, the latch catching with a soft click, and backed a step into the hallway so her shape stayed visible through the glass. The zombies came. She held her position until she was sure every set of eyes in the shrinking group was on her, and then she turned and ran. Her boots hit the carpet in a flat sprint. The bag thumped against her hip, the bow in her left hand, the backpack bouncing against her shoulders with every step. The side exit at the far end of the hall grew larger as she closed the distance, the push bar across the door catching the light, the glass above it showing a slice of gray daylight and the edge of a snow-covered lawn beyond. She heard the first impact of a body against the stairwell glass behind her, then a second, then more. The sounds of the crowd catching up with the door and hammering against it in the way they always did, when something they wanted was on the other side. She hit the side exit at full speed, slammed the push bar down with her forearm, and burst out into the cold. The side of the building ran off to her left, a long wall of brick and siding, with a set of frost-killed bushes planted along the base of it. She sprinted along the wall toward the front corner, her boots finding traction on the packed snow, her breath coming in hard clouds. She reached the corner, put her shoulder against the brick, and leaned out for a look at the front of the building. The SUV sat on the sidewalk 20 yards away, its engine still running, its exhaust still rising. The crowd at the stairwell glass door was pressed tight against the building, every head turned inward, every set of hands slapping against the glass where Riley had been standing a minute earlier. The space between her and the SUV was clear. She didn't give herself time to second-guess it. She pushed off the corner and broke into a sprint. Her boots hit the snow-packed sidewalk in a loud, fast rhythm, and the sound carried. Somewhere in the crowd behind her, a head turned. Then another. A few of the zombies at the back of the pack peeled off from the door and started shuffling after her, arms coming up, moans rising. "You gotta run!" Chapter 4. Riley ran hard. Her boots pounded the snow-packed sidewalk in a steady rhythm, and the SUV grew larger with every stride. The driver's side door still hung open the way she had left it, the cab's interior light glowing in the overcast daylight, the exhaust still rising in a thin plume from the tailpipe. Behind her, the crowd at the stairwell glass door was starting to break apart. The ones at the back of the pack had turned at the sound of her boots and were pulling away from the building, shambling out onto the sidewalk in a loose line, arms coming up, mouths working. A few had peeled off from the main group before the rest caught on, and those ones were closer to her line of travel than she wanted. She kept running and set her eyes on the open door. The closest zombie was a woman in what had been a long wool coat, half turned toward her with one arm already extended, the other dangling at an unnatural angle from an old injury. She was 10 yards off the driver's side of the vehicle and closing. Riley pulled up at 10 yards short of the SUV and stopped hard, her boots skidding on the snow. She yanked an arrow from the quiver in a single motion, set it against the string, drew, and released. The arrow crossed the short distance in a blink and punched through the bridge of the woman's nose, snapping her head back. The zombie folded sideways and dropped, her coat flaring around her as she hit the pavement. Riley was already moving again before the body finished landing. She closed the last 10 yards in 3 strides, hit the driver's side door with her free hand, and shoved it the rest of the way open, and hurled herself into the cab. She tossed the bow and the tote bag onto the passenger seat, dropped the backpack against the center console, and reached back for the door. A hand slapped the glass of the rear window as she pulled it shut. The latch caught with a hard click, and she hit the lock, and a second later, the first full body hit the driver's side of the vehicle. The SUV rocked on its suspension. Another body thumped against the rear quarter panel, then another against the hood, and the crowd from the stairwell door arrived at the vehicle in a slow, rolling wave. Faces pressed against every pane of glass. Hands slapped against the metal. The sound of the moaning came through the cab, muffled but all around her, overlapping, climbing. She grabbed the shifter, dropped it into drive, and mashed the accelerator. The tires spun, the rear wheels whined against the packed snow of the sidewalk, throwing up a fine spray of ice crystals and slush, the engine revving hard without the vehicle moving an inch. Riley felt the shudder come up through the floorboard, and her stomach dropped with it. She eased off the pedal, then pressed down again, trying to feather the throttle the way her father had taught her to work out of a stuck patch. But the hybrid's traction control was doing something she couldn't override on the fly, and the tires kept spinning. The back end started to slide sideways under her, the rear of the SUV drifting a few inches to the right as the wheels fought for purchase on the same patch of ice they couldn't break through. "Come on, come on!" She cut the wheel left, then right, then left again. Nothing caught. The back end fishtailed another few inches and the engine kept revving, and the SUV went nowhere. Bodies continued to pile against the sides. The driver's side window was dark with the shape of a zombie pressed flat against the glass, its mouth working open and shut, its eyes fixed on her face through the pane. Another was pressed against the front grille, its hands smacking on the hood. Riley took her foot off the pedal and forced herself to sit still for a count of 2, her hands white on the wheel, her breathing loud in her ears. Spinning the tires wasn't going to cut it. The ice under the drive wheels wasn't going to break up on its own. She needed friction under that rear tire, and she needed it in the next 30 seconds. Because the longer she sat here, the more of them were going to converge on her. She needed friction. Something the tire could bite into. Her eyes went to the bow on the passenger seat. "Wait." She reached across the console, grabbed the bow, and pulled an arrow from the quiver beside her. The driver's side window was still dark with the body of the zombie pressed against it, and through the gaps between its head and the frame, she could make out the shapes of a half-dozen more zombies packed against the side of the vehicle, their heads level with the rear door, their bodies clustered right where the rear wheel was sitting. One of them was pressed tight against the rear quarter panel, its shoulder against the metal, its head bent down at an angle that put its skull almost in contact with the top of the tire. She hit the button for the sunroof. The panel slid back with a whir, and cold air came flooding into the cab again, carrying the full sound of the moaning with it. Riley braced her boots on the edge of the driver's seat, grabbed the edge of the sunroof frame with her left hand, and pushed herself up through the opening with the bow in her right. The quiver strap snagged on the frame for a second, and she yanked it free. Her head and shoulders cleared the roof, and the cold hit her face hard. The crowd around the SUV filled her vision. A dozen of them, pressed in from every direction, their faces turned up toward the sound of her coming through the roof. A new wave of moans rose from the ones that spotted her, the sound building as more and more heads swiveled in her direction. She ignored them. She leaned over the driver's side edge of the roof and looked down at the rear tire. The zombie pressed against the rear quarter panel was right where she had seen it through the window, head tilted forward, its skull just above the line of the tire, its body jammed in between the SUV and the one behind it. Riley set the arrow against the string, drew, angled the bow straight down, and released at point-blank range. The arrow drove through the top of the zombie's skull and buried itself to the fletching. The body went limp instantly, its legs folding under it, its weight collapsing straight down against the side of the vehicle. It slid down the quarter panel a few inches before its shoulders caught on the rear wheel well, and its body pitched inward, the legs sliding under the rear of the SUV as it fell. One of them caught the edge of the tire on the way down and wedged itself between the tread and the pavement, the knee bent at a wrong angle, the calf and foot disappearing beneath the line of the wheel well. Riley didn't wait to see it settle. She dropped back through the sunroof, got her feet under her in the driver's seat, and slid down into it. The bow hit the passenger seat beside the bag. Her hands were back on the wheel before her weight was fully down, and she pressed the accelerator. The rear tire spun for a half second on ice, then caught on something solid. The something solid gave a little under the weight of the tread, compressed and held. The rubber bit into it and the SUV lurched forward. The wheel rolled over the obstacle in a hard thump that rocked the whole cab, the rear end dropping as the tire cleared, and then the SUV was moving. The front bumper pushed through the zombie on the hood and threw it sideways off the grill. The driver's side peeled away from the bodies pressed against it as the vehicle picked up speed, the wet, scraping sounds of flesh against metal dropping away behind her. The rear tire found clean asphalt, and the SUV surged ahead. She came off the sidewalk with a hard bounce, dropped down onto the pavement of the parking lot, and kept the pedal pressed to the floor. Don't stop, don't stop, don't stop. The lot opened up in front of her. The zombies she had left at the far end, the ones that had shambled off toward the sedan, with the arrows in its panel, were still over there, their backs to her, their bodies scattered across the pavement between the parked cars. The ones at the back of the SUV were trying to turn and follow her, their bodies pivoting in the slow, uncoordinated way that always let her see them commit to a new direction a full second before they started walking it, but she was moving now, and they were not. She cut the wheel to the right, aimed the nose of the SUV at the entry drive, and pushed through a few stragglers that hadn't made it to the vehicle in time. The bumper folded one of them forward onto the hood. The hood threw it sideways. The tires rolled over something she didn't look at in the mirror, and then she was at the exit drive, and then she was rising up the short incline toward the road. She crested the top of the drive and braked hard. The SUV shuddered to a stop just short of the main road, the brake lights painting the snow behind her a pale red, the engine idling down into a rough hum. For a long second, she just sat there, both hands on the wheel, her forehead almost touching the top of the rim, her chest rising and falling in fast, hard pulls that fogged the inside of the windshield. She made herself take the breath slower. 4 in, 4 out. Her shoulders came down. Her grip on the wheel loosened. The shaking in her hands, the shaking she hadn't noticed starting, slowed and settled. She lifted her head and looked at the world outside the windshield. The road ran off in both directions at the bottom of the drive, its surface buried under a packed layer of snow. The tire tracks she had come in on, already being filled back in by the steady fall. A strip mall sat across the way, its storefronts gutted. A single zombie drifting across the empty parking lot towards something only it could see. Nothing else moved. The complex she had just come out of sat behind her, its 3 identical buildings arranged around the lot she had fought her way out of, and she didn't let herself look back at any of it. She reached forward and tapped the GPS screen awake. The map came up the way she had left it. The purple line still traced out from the pharmacy to the apartment complex. She tapped through the menus to the destination field, cleared the old route, and typed in the name of her town with the touch keyboard. Chaffee, Wisconsin. She hit the start button. The screen chirped, thought about it for a beat, and redrew itself. A new purple line sprang into existence on the map, snaking south out of Superior, working its way through a web of city streets before hitting the main road that would take her the long way back through the country between here and home. All right, let's figure out how to get out of town. Chapter 5. Riley pulled onto the main road and turned the SUV west. The afternoon was settling in gray and cold over Superior, the sky a flat ceiling of low cloud that hadn't thinned out since she had come into town. A light snow kept falling in small dry flakes that blew sideways across the windshield before the wipers could catch them. She took the first few blocks at a slow roll, her eyes moving constantly across the streets ahead, her hands loose on the wheel. The GPS on the dash was laying out a purple line that cut south through the center of town to pick up the highway on the far side, but she wasn't going to follow it through the middle of what she had already seen. She was going to run the western edge, where the blocks thinned out and the residential streets gave way to the small commercial buildings that ring the town, and she was going to cut south from there. The first few clusters of the dead were easy to work around. A handful of zombies standing in the middle of an intersection, a small knot of them drifting across a parking lot, a few stragglers shuffling down the sidewalks between parked cars. Each time she saw a group forming up ahead, she took the next turn before she reached them, letting the SUV ease onto a side street and working her way back to her westward line 2 blocks over. The sound of the engine pulled a few heads in her direction whenever she passed close, but the speed she was holding kept her ahead of anything that tried to close on the vehicle. The blocks rolled past, a gas station picked clean, a small church with its front doors hanging open and the snow blown into the vestibule, a strip of low shops that had been stripped down to the back walls the same as everything else she had seen on the way in. The road curved south after another few blocks, and she let the SUV follow the curve, the GPS blinking its approval as the route settled into one she was actually willing to take. The streets here were wider than the ones downtown, the houses spaced further apart, the traffic thinner even before the world had ended. She passed a school with a chain-link fence ringing a snow-covered playground. She passed a long, low building that had been some kind of civic center, its windows boarded over from the inside in a way that told her someone had tried to hold it for a while before they lost it. She passed a scattering of small businesses and a veterinary clinic with the front door torn off its hinges and a drift of snow building up inside the entryway. Then she saw the pileup. It sat in the middle of the road 2 blocks ahead of her, a tangle of 3 or 4 vehicles that had met in the intersection hard enough to wrap around each other. A pickup truck had gone into the driver's side of a small sedan, the front of the truck buried deep into the crushed metal of the smaller car, and a third vehicle had come in behind them at an angle and spun sideways across both lanes. A 4th car sat off to one side, with its front end crumpled, the windshield gone, one door hanging open into the roadway. The wreck blocked the whole width of the street. There was no lane to slip through, no shoulder wide enough to take the SUV around, no way forward without climbing over something she couldn't climb over. She let off the pedal and brought the SUV down to a crawl, her eyes working the scene for any path she might have missed on the first look. A patch of yard on the left, fenced. A row of planters on the right, pressed up against the curb. No way through. She was going to have to back off, pick a side street, and work around the wreck through the residential grid behind it. She swung the SUV into the next driveway on her right, backed out facing the other direction, and cut down the side street heading east. 2 blocks in, she turned south again. The houses closed in tighter on both sides of the road here, the yards narrower, the sidewalks crowded with buried shrubs, and the angled shapes of parked cars half covered in snow. She kept her speed down and her eyes forward. The GPS on the dash reshuffled itself, the purple line jumping to a new route that would carry her back out to her southern heading, a few blocks further along. She made it 2 more turns before she saw the pack. They were filling the intersection ahead of her, a dense cluster of the dead that spilled from the center of the crossing out into all 4 streets, Their bodies spread across the pavement in overlapping clumps. 40 of them at least, maybe more. She couldn't count. Some of them were standing still, their heads tilted forward. Some of them were drifting in slow loops between the others. A few had caught the sound of her engine and had already started turning in her direction. The road she was on ran straight into the middle of the group. The road to her right dead-ended at a cul-de-sac a half block down. The road to her left circled back into the residential grid the way she had come. She hit the brakes and stopped 50 yards short of the intersection. Come on, think. She checked her mirrors. The street behind her was clear for the moment, but she had passed a half-dozen zombies in the last 2 blocks, and the ones ahead had heard her now. She could see heads coming up across the pack, bodies starting to pivot, the front rank beginning the slow walk in her direction. Going back the way she had come would work in the short term, but it would cost her another 10 or 15 minutes of threading through streets she had already eliminated as a potential path. The pack ahead was thick, but it was also just bodies, slow bodies. The SUV outweighed all of them, put together by a factor she didn't bother to run. She let out a slow breath through her nose and got her hands firm on the wheel. Straight through. Just go straight through. She pressed the pedal. The SUV picked up speed down the half block to the intersection, the tires crunching across the packed snow, the engine climbing through its gears. She held the wheel steady and aimed the nose of the vehicle at the thickest part of the pack where the bodies were tightest together, because the tight part was the part that would break apart the cleanest when she hit it. She was doing 30 when the bumper met the first one. Then she was doing 25. Then she was in the middle of them. The impact that mattered came in the first second. The front bumper met a cluster of 3 or 4 bodies pressed together, and the SUV took them all at once, the grille folding them forward and down, and one of them, a heavy one in a work jacket, dropped straight under the front end. Riley felt the front wheels come up over the body in a hard thump that rocked the whole frame, and then she felt something give underneath the rear of the vehicle as the back tires hit the same obstacle half a second later. The sound was a single hard crack that she felt more than heard, a jarring impact that came up through the floorboard, her seat and the steering column all at once, and the whole SUV shuddered with it. Something in the rear end shifted, something that was not supposed to shift. Oh no, please no. She didn't have room to stop and check. The pack was all around her now, bodies on every side, hands slapping against the windows, the moaning rising up in a wall of sound that came through the glass, muffled but relentless. She mashed the accelerator to the floor. The SUV lurched forward and ground through them. The rear end started to vibrate hard the moment she pushed the throttle, a new bad rhythm that she could feel through the seat of her pants, a rough thumping under the cargo area that didn't match anything the vehicle had done in the last hour. Bodies thumped against the sides and went down. The hood slammed forward into the chest of a tall zombie and threw it sideways, and the tires rolled over something the vehicle never used to roll over with this much shaking. The grinding under the rear end got louder as her speed climbed. Whatever had given with the first impact was getting worse with every foot of forward travel, and she didn't have a choice but to keep going. She broke through the back edge of the pack 15 seconds later and came out onto a clear stretch of road. The grinding stayed with her. The SUV was limping now, a heavy dragging vibration coming up through the back of the vehicle, the steering pulling to the right whenever she tried to accelerate. She held the wheel tight with both hands and kept the speed down, feathering the gas, trying to find a pace that didn't make the noise underneath any worse than it already was. The road ahead of her ran south in a long, gentle slope, the houses thinning out, the yards growing wider. A zombie drifted out from between 2 parked cars a block ahead, and she swung the wheel around it, felt the rear end of the SUV slide a few inches wider than it should have, and corrected back into her lane. Come on, hold together. The GPS chirped, and the purple line on the screen redrew itself, laying out a new route that would take her 2 more turns and put her on the southern highway out of town. She followed it. The first turn she made at a crawl, the SUV shuddering through the corner, the rear end threatening to slide out every time she touched the brake. The second turn was worse. Something underneath made a sharp metallic pop halfway through the corner, and the vehicle lurched to the right, and she had to fight the wheel for a full second to keep the nose pointed the way she wanted it pointed. She made it. The road ahead of her opened up into a wide southbound route, the kind of 4-lane highway that ran along the outskirts of a town, flanked by empty commercial lots and the occasional gas station sign rising up above the tree line. A small green sign at the intersection she was rolling past told her what she already knew: Highway 35. She made the turn onto it slowly, babying the SUV through the corner and straightened out in the southbound lane. The vehicle was shaking noticeably at anything above 20 miles an hour. A heavy, uneven thudding came from underneath whenever she accelerated, and the steering wheel vibrated in her hands at a frequency that set her teeth together. Something was dragging under the rear end. Something that had started with that first impact and had gotten worse every time she had asked the SUV to push through anything afterward. She glanced at the GPS screen. The distance to Chaffee ticked down in the corner: 20 miles. Riley tightened her grip on the wheel and tried to settle her breathing. The sun was starting to go. She could see the light changing through the windshield, the gray of the afternoon getting a little heavier, the shadows under the trees on either side of the road, stretching out across the snow in longer diagonals than they had been throwing half an hour ago. Another hour, maybe 2, and she was going to be driving into full dark with a broken vehicle and 20 miles between her and the only people left in the world who mattered to her. She pressed the pedal down as far as the SUV would let her, without the shaking getting worse. "Please, just get me close to home." Chapter 6. Riley made it 10 miles before the SUV started dying in earnest. The first 5 miles had been manageable. The shaking under the rear end had settled into a steady rhythm she could almost ignore if she kept her speed down around 30. And the highway south of Superior ran straight and flat through long stretches of woods and open field, with very little in the way of obstacles. She held the wheel with both hands and watched the mile markers tick past along the shoulder, counting each one down toward home. 15 miles, 14, 13. The sun dropped steadily through the gray ceiling as she drove, turning the afternoon from a flat pale light into something deeper and harder, the shadows under the roadside trees pulling long across the snow. Then, somewhere between the 10 and 9-mile markers, the sound underneath the SUV changed. The steady thumping she had been living with turned into a horrific grinding screech, a hard metallic howl that climbed up through the floorboards and filled the cab with a noise that made her teeth hurt. The vibration in the steering wheel jumped up to something her hands could barely hold against. The rear end of the SUV started to drift sideways on every small bump in the road, and a new sound joined the grinding, a sharp, repetitive clunking that matched the rotation of the rear wheels. Every rotation. Clunk, clunk, clunk. Damn it! She let off the pedal and brought the SUV down to a crawl, then eased it over onto the shoulder and stopped. The grinding cut out the moment the wheels stopped turning, leaving the engine idling and the cab suddenly quiet in a way that felt louder than the noise had been. Her ears rang and her hands were trembling on the wheel. She pushed the door open, stepped out onto the packed snow of the shoulder, and walked around to the rear of the vehicle, dropping to one knee on the shoulder to see underneath. She didn't know what she was supposed to be looking at, not in any proper mechanical sense. She had watched her father work on trucks once or twice, but had never been the one holding the wrenches, and the underside of a hybrid SUV was not something she could read the way some people could read an engine bay. She didn't need to. Whatever was wrong in a way that didn't require a diagnosis. A long piece of metal that was supposed to run straight across the rear of the vehicle was not running straight. It bowed down in the middle, kinked at an angle that looked nothing like the other side, and where it met the inside of the rear wheel, something had cracked open and was holding on by what looked like a thread. A section of it had shifted sideways by an inch or more, and she could see the damage widening every time she nudged her weight against the rear bumper with her shoulder, and the whole back end of the vehicle shifted with it. She stayed on one knee for a long moment before she spoke. 10 miles, on foot, in the dark. This isn't going to work. She ran through it in her head anyway. 10 miles was 4 hours of walking on open ground in daylight with no snow. In the dark, in the cold, through snow-covered woods and the stretches of road where the dead were thick, it was going to be longer. She pushed herself back to her feet and put her hand flat against the rear bumper of the SUV. She stood there for maybe 10 seconds and thought about the broken axle and the 10 miles and what the vehicle could still do before it quit entirely. "You can give me a few more miles. Come on, a few more." She walked back to the driver's side, climbed in, and pulled the door shut behind her. The SUV was still running. She dropped the shifter into drive and eased the pedal down slowly, wincing against the noise she knew was coming. It came. The grinding screech filled the cab on the first half rotation of the rear wheels and didn't let up as she pulled back onto the pavement. The clunking joined it a second later, and the vibration in the steering wheel resumed the hard buzz that had already worn her grip raw. She kept the speed down around 25, and the wheel pointed straight and let the SUV carry her south along the empty highway. The noise filled up every corner of her head and left no room for thinking, which she decided after a mile was probably a mercy. Whatever was left to think about could wait until she had to walk. The mile markers kept coming. 9, 8, 7.5. At just past the 7-mile marker, she saw the zombies. They were spread across both lanes of the highway, in a loose, staggered line, 10 or 12 of them drifting across the pavement, with their heads down and their arms swaying. The kind of accidental gathering that came from a dozen individual zombies ending up in the same stretch of road at the same time. None of them had heard her yet through the noise of the damaged SUV, or if they had heard her, they were still turning to work out where the noise was coming from. She could see heads starting to tilt in her direction at the outer edge of the group as she approached. The closer ones hadn't registered her yet. The gap was closing fast. She didn't have room to swerve. The rear end of the SUV was barely holding as it was, and any hard steering input was going to put her sideways across the road, with a broken axle and no way to correct it. If she went off the pavement at this speed with this much damage, she was going to be walking the rest of the way from wherever she came to rest. Straight through! Don't turn! Don't turn! She kept the wheel straight and mashed the pedal. The SUV picked up speed the way it could, which was not the way it used to be able to. The grinding from the rear axle climbed into something that sounded like metal being torn apart, and the whole vehicle started to shake so hard she had to clamp both hands on the wheel to keep it in her grip. The front bumper hit the first zombie at something under 30 and threw it sideways off the hood. The second one bounced off the passenger side fender. The third she took head-on and felt go under the front wheels, and the SUV bucked once as the rear tires cleared the body and kept going. The ones that had been farther back turned as she came through, their bodies pivoting in the slow way she had watched 1,000 times, and one of them caught the rear quarter panel with its shoulder as the vehicle rolled past and went down spinning into the road behind her. She came out the other side of the cluster and kept the pedal pressed. 6.5 miles to go. 6.25. 6. That was when it hit her. The noise was going to pull in every zombie for a mile in every direction. The grinding screech of the broken axle and the engine revving against it was not the kind of sound that faded at a distance. It was the kind of sound that carried for a long way across open ground and woods, the kind of sound that every head within earshot was going to turn toward. She hit the brakes hard and the SUV ground to a halt on the shoulder, the grinding cutting out again as the wheels locked up, the engine dropping back into a rough idle. She sat with both hands on the wheel and her chest rising and falling hard, and she stared through the windshield at the empty road ahead. Every zombie in a mile radius was coming. They were already coming. They had been coming from the moment she had pushed past the cluster on the road, and the grinding of the axle had been pulling them out of the trees and the fields and the scattered farmhouses on either side of the highway for miles behind her. If she got back in the vehicle and drove the last 6 miles to Chaffee, she was going to roll up her own driveway with a parade of the dead at her back, every one of them drawn out of their wandering and committed to following the noise. I can't lead them back home. I'm going to have to go on foot. She sat with that for a second, her hands still on the wheel. 6 miles on foot, in the dark that was coming, with a broken SUV behind her and a bag of medicine across her lap. She had done harder things in the last 2 days. She could do this too. Then she glanced up at the rearview mirror and saw the movement. Back down the road where she had just come from, the shapes of zombies emerging from the tree line along the shoulder, 6 of them already on the pavement and shambling south in her direction. More behind them. More coming out of the trees with every second she watched. The grinding of the axle had pulled them out of the woods the way she had known it would, and they were in her wake now, following the noise trail she had left behind. And those things are going to just keep following me. She tried to work out what to do about that. If she got out of the SUV and started walking, the ones behind her were going to keep coming at her pace instead of the SUV's pace, and they were going to close the distance over the next 6 miles no matter how fast she moved. The cold was going to slow her down. The dark was going to slow her down. The weight of the bag and the backpack and everything in them was going to slow her down. The zombies didn't get tired. They didn't get cold. They didn't stop. She needed them to stop following her, and she needed them to follow something else instead. Her eyes dropped to the dashboard, to the radio panel set below the GPS screen, and the idea came in a single clean piece. The stereo. She leaned over, thumbed the power button on the radio, and the head unit lit up. A CD was already loaded. She hit play, and a soft piano line started up from the speakers, the kind of light jazz tune that came out of somebody's collection of drive-to-work music, unhurried. A saxophone coming in a few bars later and winding around the melody. Not loud, not grating, the kind of music that would hold a head that was already tilted toward it. She rolled down the driver's side window and turned the volume up, a little at a time, until the music carried clean out onto the shoulder without blowing out at the edges. Someone walking the road in a mile would hear it. Something with no higher brain function would hear it and turn. She left the engine running, left the headlights on, left the heater ticking. Cutting anything off was going to change whatever the zombies were locking onto, and she wanted that lock to stay right here where she was leaving it. She grabbed the tote bag from the passenger seat, slung the backpack across her shoulders and settled the straps, then pulled the bow across her body and made sure the quiver was seated. She opened the driver's door, stepped out into the snow, and pushed it shut behind her with her hip. The jazz kept playing behind her, soft and steady, a warm sound coming out of an open window on an abandoned car in the middle of nowhere. She walked a few yards forward along the shoulder, then cut off the pavement and into the ditch on the east side of the road. The trees rose up beyond the ditch in a thick line, and she pushed into them, angling away from the highway in a straight line until she had put maybe 30 yards of forest between herself and the shoulder. The road was still visible through the trunks when she stopped to check, the SUV's headlights glowing dimly through the branches, the faint thread of music still reaching her at this distance. She turned south and started walking parallel to the road, using the line of the highway as a handrail while she moved through the cover of the trees. The snow under her boots was deep and soft. Every step was going to be work. The sun was almost gone now, the light under the trees dropping toward dusk, the cold coming up out of the ground into her legs. 6 more miles, you got this. Chapter 7. The first mile through the woods was the worst of it. Every step punched her boot down through a layer of frozen crust into the soft powder beneath, and every step had to be pulled back out of the same hole before she could place the next one. Her thighs burned inside 10 minutes. Her calves were gone inside 20. The bag across her shoulder kept drifting to one side with the rhythm of her walk, and she had to keep shifting it back, rolling the weight between her hips and her spine to keep any one part of her body from giving out before the others. The cold came up out of the ground through the soles of her boots and into her feet, and settled there, and she stopped being able to feel her toes somewhere around the half-mile mark. Her hands were worse. The bow in her left made it impossible to keep the hand tucked anywhere warm, and the glove she was wearing was not rated for a march in the dark through December woods. She kept walking anyway. The darkness filled in around her as she moved. The last gray of the afternoon drained out of the sky over the first 40 minutes, and by the time she had covered what she estimated was the first mile and a half, the woods around her had gone flat and shapeless, the trees reduced to darker columns against a darker ground, the path ahead visible only by the vague difference between the snow that held the dim starlight and the shadows that didn't. She tripped twice. The first time she caught herself against a trunk and kept walking. The second time she went down to one knee in the snow and stayed there for a long moment, her chest heaving, her breath fogging the air in front of her face in a long, uneven plume. She got back up because there was no other option. She kept walking because that was the only thing left to do. Somewhere past the second mile, the pain in her legs stopped being a thing she was aware of and turned into the baseline she was walking on top of. Her knees were a dull throb. Her lower back had locked up into a band of tightness that ran from hip to hip. Her shoulders burned from carrying the bag. She stopped feeling the individual hurts and started just feeling that she hurt, and it turned out the second state was easier to walk through than the first one had been. A little past the 3-mile mark, the clouds broke. She didn't notice it happening at first. She had been watching the ground in front of her boots for so long that the change in the light took a minute to reach her, and she only looked up when she realized the snow ahead of her was suddenly easier to see. The cover above the woods had thinned out to a long, ragged strip of gaps, and a half moon was hanging in one of them, bright enough to push a pale silver wash down through the branches and across the floor of the forest. The trunks around her were suddenly picked out in hard, dark lines. The drifts of snow between them glowed a faint, cold blue. She stopped walking and tilted her face up and looked at the sky for a long moment, and then she let out a slow breath that felt like it had been waiting inside her for miles. Thank God for small miracles. She started walking again, and with the moonlight helping her pick her footing, her pace came up half a notch. The new rhythm didn't feel like an improvement, so much as a reduction in how much every step was costing her, but she would take it. She watched the trees ahead of her and kept the road somewhere off to her right, catching the faint glow of the moon off the pavement through the trunks at intervals, holding her southward line by it. The 4th mile passed, the 5th mile passed. Somewhere into the last half of the 6th, she started recognizing the woods. The land around Chaffee had been her hunting ground since she was 12, and she knew the shape of these trees the way a person knew the shape of a room they had grown up sleeping in, the way the ridge rose up slightly to her left, the break in the pines where a stand of birch had come up after a fire a decade back, the small frozen creek she had crossed 100 times with her father in the fall, and which she found under her boots now, in a thin band of black ice and dead reeds. She didn't need landmarks to know she was close. Her legs knew. The part of her that had walked these woods for half her life knew. She was less than a mile out. Then, further down the line of her walk, she heard it. The moaning came drifting through the trees ahead of her, thin and low, carrying on the cold air from somewhere south and slightly west. Not one voice, several. Overlapping in the way a small group did, the way a handful of the dead did when they had gathered around something they wanted but couldn't reach. The sound cut through her, and she froze with one boot in the snow and the other still lifted, her breath held tight in her chest. Harper? The name came out of her before she thought it. She said it quietly, almost to herself, and then she was moving, her pace climbing up past the careful rhythm she had been holding for 6 miles. Her boots punched through the crust faster now, her arms working, the bag banging against her hip with every stride. The pain in her legs came screaming back up, out of wherever it had gone, and she walked right through it. She was close enough to home that the woods were beginning to thin on her left. She could make out, through the trunks, the pale square of the clearing where her own property opened up out of the trees. The moaning got louder as she closed the distance. She slowed at the edge of the tree line and dropped into a half crouch, working her way forward through the last stand of pines until she could see the house. Her home sat in the middle of the cleared ground the way it always had, the dark shape of it solid against the moonlit snow, the solar array at the back catching a faint silver along its edges. The windows glowed a dim yellow from the inside. Harper had the oil lamps going in, at least 2 of the rooms. The zombies were on her house, 6 of them. She counted them in a glance. 5 were bunched against the front of the house, pressed up against the one of the front room windows, their bodies overlapping, their arms reaching up toward the window. The 6th was drifting at the corner of the house, separated from the group, its head tilted forward, its feet working through the snow, in the short, aimless loops of a zombie that had lost the thread of whatever it was doing. Ahead of the cluster at the front, the window was open. She could see the shape of her sister inside it, framed in the dim lamplight, leaning forward with the makeshift spear extended out through the opening. Harper was working the blade into the head of the zombie directly in front of the window, both hands on the broom handle, her weight behind it, the way Riley had taught her. The zombie by the window jerked once as the point drove in, and the body slumped against the side of the house and started to slide down. The other 4 zombies pressed against the wall, turned their heads up toward the movement in the window as the body dropped, their mouths opening, their moans climbing. Riley didn't let herself think about it. She broke from the tree line at a dead run. Her boots hit the open snow of the clearing, and she pulled the bow up as she moved, her right hand already going to the quiver for an arrow. The 6th zombie, the one at the corner of the house, turned first. Its head came around, and its body followed a beat behind, its arms lifting as it started toward the new noise. The ones at the front wall were slower to respond, still focused on the window. She knocked and drew on the run, stopped 10 yards from the corner zombie, and released. The arrow punched through its forehead, and the creature went down in a heap against the side of the house. She was already pulling a second arrow as its body hit the snow. She pivoted to her right, drew on the closest zombie still pressed against the wall, and released. The shaft took the zombie in the temple, and the body slid down the clapboards to pile on top of the one Harper had already dropped. 2 arrows, 2 zombies. No arrows left in the quiver. "Harper!" The shape in the window swung around, the spear coming up, and her sister's voice came out hard and surprised and full of everything at once. "Riley!" The 3 remaining zombies at the wall had fully turned now, their attention pulled off the window and onto the running figure in the yard. They pushed off from the side of the house and started shambling toward her through the snow, arms coming up, the low chorus of moans rolling out from their open mouths. "Just stay quiet. I'll handle this." She shrugged the tote bag off her shoulder and let it drop into the snow. The backpack came off next, hitting the ground beside it with a soft thud. She kept the bow in her left hand and moved sideways along the edge of the clearing, making herself loud, her boots stomping down hard into the crust, her free hand waving over her head. The 3 zombies drifted after her in a slow, loose triangle, their heads locked on, their arms out. She backed away along the side of the yard, keeping 20 feet between herself and the nearest of them, and she kept backing up until all 3 were a good 30 feet away from the house and pulled fully out onto the open snow. Then she broke into a sprint. She ran a wide arc around the outside of the group, staying out of reach, her boots pounding through the drifts. The zombies tried to pivot after her, but their turns were slow and clumsy, and by the time the closest one had oriented on her new direction, she was already past the far side and angling back toward the house. She reached the corpse at the corner first. She dropped to one knee, put her boot against its shoulder, and yanked the arrow free with a hard pull that came out clean. She knocked and drew in the same motion, rose back up to her feet, and turned on the closest of the 3 shamblers. It was 15 feet out and still working its way through a clumsy turn toward her. She put the arrow through the side of its head above the ear, and it went down sideways into the snow. She didn't wait. She was already running for the second body, the one she had dropped against the wall. She pulled the arrow from that one's temple, spun with it in her hand, and set it against the string as she came around to face the next zombie. It was closer than she wanted, 10 feet. She drew and loosed, and the shaft took it square between the eyes, and the body folded forward and dropped face first into the snow at her feet. 1 zombie left. An older man in a torn coat, maybe 20 feet out, shambling toward her across the open ground, with his arms raised and his moan building. Her quiver was empty, and both arrows she had used were lying in the snow behind her, in fresh corpses she didn't have time to retrieve. "Give me the spear!" Harper's shape moved fast in the window. The makeshift spear came out through the opening, broom handle first. The taped blade turned away from her, and Riley ran for it. She reached up with her free hand, caught the handle near the middle, and pulled. The spear came free of Harper's grip, and Riley spun with it already coming up. The zombie was 5 feet out when she set her back foot and drove forward, planting the blade through the soft spot under its chin and driving up. The point punched through the top of its skull, and the body dropped at her feet, the broom handle coming free as it fell. The yard went quiet. Riley stood there for a long second, with the spear held loose in her left hand, and the bow still in her right, her chest heaving, her breath fogging in long, hard clouds in front of her face. Then her legs gave out from under her, and she dropped to one knee in the snow. The front door of the house opened, and Harper came out running. She hit the snow at a full sprint, her feet sliding as she crossed the packed yard, and she didn't slow down until she was 3 feet from Riley and dropping to her own knees in front of her. Her eyes were wet, her face was pale, and she looked like she was fighting hard not to break apart. "Riley, are you okay?" Riley looked at her sister for a long moment. She was too tired for much of what she was feeling to make it to her face. She put one hand on Harper's shoulder and squeezed it, and when she spoke, her voice came out flat and even, the way she needed it to come out. "I'm fine. Get my bags. There's medicine in there." Harper nodded hard, her mouth working without quite making words, And then she was up on her feet and running across the snow to where Riley had dropped the bags at the edge of the clearing. Riley watched her go. Then she pushed the butt of the spear down into the snow beside her, leaned her weight onto the broom handle, and worked her way back up to her feet. Her knees protested, her back screamed. She stayed up anyway. She and Harper met at the front door. Harper had both bags slung across her shoulders and a hand already on the doorknob. She pushed the door open and they stepped inside together, Harper shouldering it shut behind them and throwing the deadbolt. Riley leaned the spear against the wall beside the door. The warmth of the wood stove hit her a second later, the heat rolling over her face and hands in a wave that made her eyes sting. "Let me see the bag." Harper shrugged the tote off her shoulder and held it out. Riley took it, crossed to the small table by the couch, and set it down. She pulled the bag open and dug through it with hands that had gone clumsy with cold and exhaustion. The bottles clinked against each other as she worked them aside, reading labels by the light of the oil lamp on the table. The extra-strength flu medication came up near the top, where she had packed it. She pulled the first bottle out, broke the seal, and held it out to her sister. "Give this to Mom." Harper took it with both hands and nodded once. She turned and ran for the hallway, her bare feet slapping softly against the floorboards. And then she was around the corner and gone. Riley stood beside the table for a second longer. Then she turned and walked the 4 steps to the couch and sat down hard. The cushions gave under her, and her back settled against them, and her eyes closed before her head had fully come to rest against the back of the couch. The bag was on the table. The medicine was going to her mother. Harper was safe. The house was secure. She had done it. "I made it. I made it." Chapter 8. The sun came in through the front window and found Riley's face. She surfaced out of sleep in slow stages, the light pulling her up through layers of a darker, heavier rest than she had been inside of in a long time. The warmth on her cheek registered first. The ache in her legs and back registered second, coming up out of her muscles in a deep, slow throb the moment she tried to stir against the cushions. She had no idea where she was. Then she placed the weight of the blanket over her, the smell of wood smoke and pine, the particular give of the couch under her shoulder, and her eyes opened a crack on the familiar ceiling of her own front room. The smell of food was what brought the rest of her awake, a warm, buttery smell drifting out of the kitchen, underlaid with something savory and a little sharp, something with fat in a hot pan. Her stomach answered it before the rest of her caught up, a hollow pang that made her press a hand against her belly without thinking. She blinked at the ceiling for a long second, working up to moving, and then she pushed herself up on one elbow and turned her head toward the kitchen. Harper was at the stove. Her sister was in a pair of thick socks and a flannel shirt Riley recognized as her own, her dark hair pulled back into a short ponytail, the wooden spoon in her hand, working slow circles through whatever was in the pan in front of her. She was humming something. She looked over when the couch creaked, caught Riley watching her, and a grin came up across her face. "Well, good morning, sleepyhead. Or should I say good afternoon?" Riley tried to say something, and her throat was too dry to make the first word work. She swallowed, cleared her throat, and tried again. Her voice came out thick. "What time is it?" "Don't worry about it. You've earned the day off." Riley turned her head the other way, toward the small wall clock above the bookshelf. The hands were hard to focus on for a moment, but when they came clear, they read a little past 1 in the afternoon. She stared at the face for a long second, trying to make the number line up with the last thing she remembered, which was the couch receiving her weight in what had still been full night. "How long was I out?" Harper glanced over from the stove with the spoon in her hand. "Not long enough. I was going to let you keep sleeping, but I figured that you might be hungry." Riley pushed the blanket off her legs and tried to sit up the rest of the way. Her thighs went tight across the fronts in a long, hard cramp that made her breath catch, and her lower back refused to uncurl from the shape it had spent the night in. She got as far as upright, and then her legs locked and refused to carry her any further. She sank back onto the cushions with a short, strangled sound, one hand braced against the armrest. Harper had her eyes on her from across the room. "Just stay there. I'll bring you something." "What are you cooking?" Harper turned back to the pan and gave the contents another stir. "I figured you deserved something special, so I cracked open a can of that spiced meat you like. scrambled it up with some powdered eggs. A smile worked its way across Riley's face before she had decided to let it. She leaned her head back against the couch cushion and closed her eyes for a second, letting the smell reach her again now that she knew what it was. "Thank you, Harper. What would I do without you? Go hungry for one." A laugh came up out of Riley's chest before she could catch it, short and dry but real, and she heard Harper snort from the kitchen a half-beat behind it. The warm, round feeling of that small, shared moment sat in the middle of her chest for maybe 3 seconds before something cold slipped in underneath it, a realization she had not let land yet because she had been too far under. Her eyes opened and her head came up off the cushion. "Mom, how's Mom?" Harper kept her hands on the pan, but her voice softened into something careful and steady. "She's doing a lot better. She's napping, but I gave her another dose this morning." "Her fever?" "Just under 100. I think it broke overnight. Might have something to do with the medicine you brought her." Riley let out a sigh of relief, and her head sank back against the couch. She felt something in her chest unwind by a degree she hadn't known it had been wound to. Not all the way, not close, but a little. She nodded, her eyes closing again, and she let herself sit with that for a moment while the kitchen sounds went on behind her. A plate came down on the counter, the scrape of a spoon against a pan, the soft clink of a cup against the tile. Harper came around the end of the couch a minute later, with a plate in one hand and a cup of hot tea in the other. She set them down carefully on the small side table within Riley's reach, the steam from both rising up in the thin curls into the afternoon light. Riley looked at the plate, a mound of scrambled eggs flecked with pieces of the pink-spiced meat browned at the edges, a piece of toast on the side from the bread they had baked the week before Riley left. Her mouth started watering before she had fully registered how hungry she was. "Now you just sit there and enjoy. I got your favorite movie in the DVD player. All you have to do is hit play. We need to conserve power." Harper rolled her eyes and reached for the remote on the table. "Relax. I kept just about everything off while you were gone. We're over 50% and it's bright and sunny outside. We can spare a little power for you to relax." Riley started to form an objection and then let it die. She nodded instead, her eyes going to the plate. She picked up the fork, which was heavier than a fork should be, and got a bite onto the tines. The first mouthful hit her tongue, and she closed her eyes without meaning to. The salt of the meat, the warmth of the eggs, the texture of food that had been cooked with care rather than opened out of a tin cold. She chewed slowly. "Thank you, Harper. This is wonderful." Harper nodded and lowered herself onto the couch beside her. She tucked her feet up under herself, the way she had always done, and watched Riley work through the first few bites, her eyes soft, her mouth pulled into a small, quiet smile. Neither of them said anything for a stretch. Riley ate. Harper watched her eat. Outside the front window, the bright cold afternoon pushed its light across the snow in a way that made the whole front yard glow, and the quiet in the house settled into something Riley had not felt since she could not remember when. Then Harper spoke, her voice pitched low, the question coming out careful. "So, how was it out there?" Riley stopped with the fork halfway to her mouth. She held it there for a second, then lowered it back to the plate. Her jaw worked through one swallow and then another, while she tried to sort out what words would fit, and the words she could come up with did not fit, so she picked the smallest true one she had. It wasn't good. The tone carried everything she had not said, and she knew from the way Harper's face shifted that her sister had heard all of it. Harper didn't push. She looked down at her own hands for a second, then looked back up with the same soft, steady expression she had been wearing since Riley had come up off the couch. "Well, if you need to talk through what happened, I'm here for you, sis." Riley forced a smile. It did not reach her eyes, and she knew it. She nodded anyway. "Thank you, Harper." She went to pick the fork back up, and her hand shook. Not much. A small tremor that ran through her fingers and set the tines rattling faintly against the porcelain of the plate before she got the fork back up into her palm. An image flashed behind her eyes without warning. The parking lot at the apartment complex, the sound of the grinding axle on the highway, the open driver's side window of the SUV playing music to an empty road. Her throat tightened. Her hand shook again. Harper saw it before Riley could catch it. Her sister was up and moving before Riley had finished registering what was happening, snatching the remote off the side table with one fluid motion. The television came on in a soft electronic click, the DVD menu flickering up onto the screen, the music of an opening track she had loved for half her life, swelling up out of the small speakers at a low, comforting volume. "There's another helping in the pan if you want more. I'm going to go check on Mom. If you need me, just yell." Riley nodded. She could not trust herself to speak. Harper gave her one last look, soft and careful, and then she padded off across the floor in her thick socks and disappeared down the hallway toward the back bedroom. Riley held the fork over the plate for a long second. Her hand shook again. She set the fork back down. The television kept playing beside her, the opening scene of a movie she had watched a dozen times with her father on quiet, snowed-in weekends. The lines of dialogue she had memorized years ago drifting out of the speakers in a friendly, familiar rhythm. She stared at the screen without quite seeing it for a moment. Then one of the characters said something she had been laughing at since she was 12, and a small surprised laugh came up out of her chest before she had decided to let it out. She picked the fork back up. The tremor was still there, but it was less. She got another bite into her mouth and chewed. The movie rolled on. The sun pushed its warm light across the front of the couch. The house ticked softly around her the way it always had in the afternoon. The wood stove in the corner settling, the soft hum of the solar inverter in the closet, the faint sound of Harper's voice from the back bedroom saying something gentle to their mother that Riley could not make out the words of and did not need to. She ate her food slowly. She watched the movie. She thought about what she had done and where she had been and what it had cost her. And she knew, with the kind of knowing that sat low in the chest and did not argue, that some of what had happened out there was going to stay with her for a long time. It would come back in pieces. It would come back at odd hours. It would come back when a sound or a smell or a color of light pulled a particular memory up out of wherever memories lived, and she would have to live through it again. But not today. Today the sun was out. Today her sister was humming to their mother in the back of the house and coming back with an empty medicine cup. Today there was food on her plate, tea in her cup, and a movie she loved playing in the corner of the room. Today the fever was down. Today the door was locked. Today the three of them were inside these walls and alive. She took another bite and let the warmth of it move through her. She was home. They were safe. That was enough for now. The end.